session meeting number 2 for this school year, I believe. Is that right? We talked about the Declaration of Independence last month, and now it's on to the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Can everybody see and hear me okay? Yes, yes, okay. Looks like I'm getting a lot of yeses. If not, right, we can try to help you with if you're having any tech issues, but it looks like everybody is on board. So again, welcome back, everybody. Good to see you all again. Just to remind you, this is, a conversation, a discussion. So we don't, need to raise hands here. We don't even use the raise hand function in the chat, which can be sometimes confusing. If you want to jump into the conversation, all you have to do is just unmute yourself. Make sure you unmute yourself first and then jump into the conversation. Guys, it's a good idea to keep yourself muted. Otherwise, we get some background noise and it can be distracting at times. It sounds like maybe 1 or 2 people are unmuted right now, so maybe double check that. But when you want to say something, when you want to jump into the conversation, just hit that unmute button, jump in, and right, as the preacher says, right, just jump in with the Spirit moved you. You don't have to be worried about interrupting me. In fact, I would encourage you to interrupt me if you have something interesting to say. I'm Jason Stevens from Ashland University in the Ashbrook Scholar Program. I'd say I think that's good for an introduction. You all know me. I've worked with you folks before, so good to see you all back again. And I want to just maybe say as a preface to right before we jump into this document, keep in mind, if you can, what we said last time about the Declaration of Independence, right, about the role of in particular the laws of nature and nature's God. What we said about that and what role that plays in civilized society. In many ways, conversations going forward will keep referencing back to the Declaration of Independence, even though we move on to different documents. The first principles of the Declaration, right, those never go away, and you see them surface and resurface in these other documents going forward. So if maybe that's something we can keep in mind for the next hour as we go through Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Keep in mind, how does some of this, what we're seeing in this document, relate to what we read in the Declaration last time? I'm not posing that as a question right now, but maybe that is something we can think about, keep in the back of our mind as we go through this document. Hopefully, you all read this piece. It's a short piece from Jefferson from January of 1786, right? So about a year and a half or so before the Constitutional Convention. The Revolutionary War is over. The Articles of Confederation are in effect. But there is no U.S. Constitution yet, so which means there is no First Amendment guaranteeing the right of free exercise of religion and prohibiting establishments of religion at the national level. I want to maybe start with this question. It's related to the document, but sort of only on the periphery. We've read now 2 documents from Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence, now the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Have any of you been to Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home? Yes, it sounds like some of you, yes, others, no, maybe. When you've been at Monticello, I mean, there's so much there, right? There's so much we could talk about. If you haven't gone, I would highly encourage you to check it out. But have any of you seen where Thomas Jefferson is? Right at Monticello, have you seen his tombstone? What is his tombstone? What does his tombstone say? Does anybody know? Or maybe if you saw it, do you remember? He's buried at Monticello. So what does his tombstone say? Somebody guessed R.I.P. That's a good guess. That's a good guess, but no, incorrect. Anybody know what his tombstone says?
If no students know, I know.
Richmond, you want to help us out here?
He said the things he wanted to be remembered for And I believe it the Declaration of Independence, the founding of the University of Virginia, and this statute.
Exactly right. Jefferson had a lot to brag about. Right? President of the United States, Vice President of the United States, First Secretary of State. And yet on his tombstone, and Jefferson designs this himself, right? He designed the whole thing, even it went down to the details of what it would say. And he had to say something like, here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, the father of the University of Virginia. One of the things Jefferson wanted to be remembered for was the author of this document and the author of the Declaration of Independence. And so these first two works that we're reading here, Jefferson, that's what Jefferson wanted to be remembered for. The author, they're not president, not vice president, not first secretary of state. This is what he wanted to be remembered for. Any ideas maybe why? I mean, I don't know if there's a right answer to this question. It's really big, but just to get the conversation going, why do you think Jefferson wanted to be remembered for as the author of the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom? Why did Jefferson think this was so important? Of religious freedom.
Because he considers freedom, like the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, as a very important topic, and he wants to be remembered for having some ideas about freedom and about it.
That's a great point. So that was Nicholas? That was you, right, Nicholas Shea? So Nick, what's important about the subject of this document? I agree with you. I think Jefferson thinks it's really important. What is important about it?
To be he sees it's important for people to kind of have their own ideas and not be controlled by other people. And this is the religious freedom is another facet of overall freedom.
Especially the freedom of the human mind, which he talks about there in the very first line of the document, right? Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free. So there's this emphasis on individual freedom, on the freedom of the human mind to understand truth and pursue truth. I think that's a great point. Why else would the subject of religious freedom be important to Jefferson? It's too broad. Let's see if maybe we could try to narrow this down a bit. Let me ask the question this way.
Probably.
Go ahead. Somebody want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say probably one of the reasons he was outside of his personal faults or things that he's done in his personal life, maybe religious freedom was important to him because he was also, instrumental in dealing with other religions and other faiths internationally, and maybe hopefully that they will come and join us here in America.
So what is the state of religious liberty prior to, let's say, 1776? What is the state of religious liberty in the world prior to the United States and the American Revolution, prior to the time of Thomas Jefferson? Much about the history of religious liberty? I mean, one of the things the founders took, not just Jefferson, but the founders in general, perhaps the most important was their establishment of religious liberty in the country. Because the state of religious liberty up until this time, I mean, it's not too far.
It basically didn't exist.
It basically doesn't exist anywhere. That's right. Yeah, prior to 1776, in most places in the world, including most of colonial America, there's very little religious liberty. right, if any at all, the prevailing view, right, among right all societies for pretty much since time immemorial, the prevailing view was that government chooses the religion, was that government should forbid or discourage any religious opinions or religiously motivated actions that are not in conformity with the religion approved by government. So government might approve one religion, and if it's right, if it's a good government, it will then sort of tolerate other views. But that's like the best you could hope for. A lot of times government would just establish a religion and you had to conform it. If you didn't, you either had to get out or you lost your head in many cases. Even in the United States, as recently as 1774, Baptists were still being jailed in Virginia for the crime of preaching without a government issued license. Right? So I want us to try to wrap our minds around just how revolutionary this idea was of religious liberty. Yeah, you guys are exactly right. Jefferson thinks this is important, but he also thinks it's important for not just the United States, but for the world, because the tradition of the world was against religious liberty. What Jefferson and the other founders are trying to establish here in the United States is something very different than you would see anywhere else at any other time in world history, in human history. That you have the natural right to your religious opinions, to form your own religious opinion, to follow what you believe to be God's laws in your ordinary life. The idea that the mind is free that Jefferson starts off with here, this is extraordinary. This is revolutionary, and it really does end up changing the world. We maybe read some of the document. We haven't read much of the document. I guess first of all, any questions on that? I just wanted to, right, you don't really see that in the document to appreciate what Jefferson's up to here. That sort of background info is important, but I want to go to the document unless there are any objections. Okay. Somebody want to maybe just read out loud for us? We can just start at the beginning and see what we find. Girls out there want to give this a shot? Yeah. Who's that?
Zechariah Godwell, but Zeke is what everybody else calls me.
Thank you for volunteering, Zeke. I appreciate it. So you could just start at the top.
Okay, so we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? If
That's the Declaration.
you're talking about, sorry, I misunderstood. I thought.
That's okay. The Virginia Statute for religious freedom.
Okay, never mind. I do not have a hard copy of that on me. Sorry, I misunderstood by that.
Somebody have it?
I can read it.
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to by temporal punishment or burthens, or by civil incapacitations, to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness,
You gotta admit it came through pretty good though.
departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as it was in his mighty power to do. That the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose on others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world, and through all time.
Okay, you can stop there for a moment. That was really well done, Catherine. You read that extremely well. What do you guys notice? Anything here jump out at you in the sort of the opening salvo of this statute?
Oh no.
Yeah, was somebody trying to chime in here?
There we go.
Eric, go ahead and hop in.
So I think it kind of sets up a future argument regarding the fallibility of men, and I think he covers it later on at some point.
Yeah, the fallibility of man, specifically in regards to what?
Religion and
Yeah,
like what religion is the best.
religion is the right one,
So slow.
or how to properly worship God. What is the best way? What is the best way or mode of worshiping God? That is something that apparently human beings have been trying to solve and figure out for a long time, but I can't quite pin down. And what have they been doing in the meantime? There's this talk about, right, attempts to influence the human mind by temporal punishments or burthens. Temporal punishments or burthens. Temporal meaning earthly, right? Punishments meaning sort of fines, imprisonment, maybe even death. Burdens, again, fines, fees, other punishments, imposed by civil government, civil authorities upon to influence the human mind and how it thinks, how it operates, how it works. And Jefferson says, is that good or bad, right? That temporal punishments have been used to influence the human mind. Is that good or bad? Okay. The opening paragraph here. Several of you are trying to chime in here on the written chat. Why don't you just unmute yourselves and jump into the conversation? Let me ask the question again. Where he talks about temporal punishments and burdens being imposed on the human mind to try to influence it, right? These what we call civil incapacitations. Why does Jefferson come out, right, in opposition to to those temporal punishments on the human mind?
I think he's
Trying to tell human beings how to think, and specifically how to think about religion.
I think he's trying to make a point that the mind is basically free. You're trying to make an argument for that you are free to think whatever you desire to think. And so that kind of provides like backdrop for the remainder of his argument.
Yeah, so why does he start off with that argument, Aaron? That's a great point. Yeah, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free. What do you take him to mean by that?
I think
I'm glad you bring that to our
particularly the part where he starts saying whereas Almighty God, because religion was a greater portion of the culture back then, so by trying to appeal to the religious senses, he could get the reader's attention.
Unfortunately, it gets the reader's attention, but what does it mean that the mind is free?
As I said, it's your thoughts can't really be influenced unless you truly believe. Like you can only think what you truly believe. Basically, all these attempts to influence by temporal punishments or burdens, they usually don't work unless you can truly convince the person you're trying to impose the thoughts on to actually believe what you're saying.
Yeah, you might be able to change somebody's mind, maybe not through temporal punishments. Or maybe you could change their minds through argument or reason, or right trying to have a discussion with them. Somebody else wanted to jump in here. Please go ahead.
By starting off by saying whereas, he's setting up a contrast between how God treats us and how other people are treating him at the time, which would have been very important to his readers.
Yeah, Abigail, is that you?
Yes.
Your point. That's a really good point. You said he's contrasting how Almighty God treats us. In other words, he created us with free minds,
Mhm.
right, that are free to pursue the truth, understand justice and injustice, good and bad, right and wrong. But human beings, are using these temporal punishments
Yeah.
or burthens,
Yeah.
civil incapacitations to try to force the mind into slavery, some sort of subjugation where you must think this way. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just like uh just contrasting how God doesn't try to force us on that, and he's also building his credibility by saying
Jefferson's credibility.
that. Yeah, he's like trying to boost his own credibility, kind of with this thesis statement here.
His thesis that mighty God hath created the mind free.
Mhm.
So this is really interesting. And I think you're exactly right about that, Abigail. I once had a professor who would tell the class, he would say, you don't have to agree with me about anything, right? In this class, we might talk about a lot of controversial subjects, right? We may not always agree. This professor would say, to get a good grade in this class, you don't have to agree with them. But the one thing that you must agree with me about is that the mind is free. That the mind is free. That it's not shackled by external circumstances, that it's not sort of subjugated to a condition of slavery where it can't break through and think freely for itself, to think and to consider and pursue the high things and the low, right? High things, right? Justice, injustice, right, wrong, good, bad, advantageous and disadvantageous, but also the low, just to think through evidence and facts and trying to come to conclusions or draw conclusions from evidence, right? That the mind is capable of doing that. The mind is, in other words, not something temporal punishments or civil authority or sort of external circumstances, right, take a hold of and basically force it. I hear it looks like several of you are chiming in here saying, yeah, you sound like you're agreeing here with Jefferson or this old professor. Yeah, he always told us you don't have to agree with me on anything. You do have to agree with me, though, that the mind is free, that the mind is free to sort of sit down and read a document like this, a hard old text like the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and go, you know what? I'm not quite sure what Jefferson's trying to say here, but I'm going to try to think through it. And by the way, you all, I think, know that the mind is free in some way. You've experienced this, right? Whenever the light bulb goes off in your head, or right, teachers, whenever right, we teachers see the light bulb go off in the child's head, in the student's head, excuse me, right? That's evidence that the mind is free, that it's no longer a slave, right? It's no longer angry and now sort of understands something that it didn't see before. Is saying the whole history of the world, when it comes to religious liberty, way or another sort of violated the freedom of the human mind, trying to impose, right, sort of punishments and burdens upon it, right? You must think this way, and if you don't, right, you'll be punished.
I've been looking at some of the chat things going on, and Daniel Kim made a good point. He said, I think Jefferson was trying to say that the fact that people were forcing their religion on others was a direct contradiction of their own God's nature. So it's
wonderful.
Yeah.
I couldn't have put it better. I couldn't have put it better myself. That was great.
Aspen said, let me find that. I think he's saying it's God gives us religious freedom. Who are we as humans to try and impose a religion on people?
Another great comment. Wow, this is really interesting. That's really well said. Let me see if I can pull up this chat. There we go. maybe I can. So can we maybe take a step back here just a second? Can we try to define our terms here? What does Jefferson mean when he speaks about religious freedom? Clearly, I mean, this Virginia statute, that's right. This is a law, right? The Virginia Assembly is passing a particular law having to do with religious freedom. I understand the Virginia statute part, but maybe we need to say a little bit more about what religious freedom is. Does Jefferson in the document ever tell us anything sort of about what the nature of religious liberty is or religious freedom? Religious freedom, religious liberty. It's sometimes called the right of conscience. You see that in many of the founding documents, our rights of conscience. Or to use the language of the First Amendment that will come later in a few years, what's the language of the First Amendment on this? The First Amendment doesn't say religious liberty or religious freedom or the rights of conscience. What does it say? Check out what the amendment says. What does the First Amendment say?
I've got it. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibit free exercise thereof.
There it is. Yeah, the free exercise. Liberty, religious freedom, rights of conscience, or to use the language of the First Amendment, the free exercise of religion. Those all mean approximately the same thing. What do they mean?
Well, I think one other thing that's in the First Amendment that's also in this Virginia statute is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which is what Jefferson's really arguing here, that the state government should not be in charge of deciding on the official religion.
Deciding on the official religion or what official religious opinions ought to be, like what is religious orthodoxy, or requiring mandatory church attendance, or providing for taxpayer-funded pastors or taxpayer-funded churches. I also love this part in the First Amendment about the freedom of speech. Speech must be free because the mind is free. If the mind isn't free, then speech can't be free. But if the mind is free, then speech must be free. Yeah, that's another important point. We've got those two ideas in the First Amendment, and I agree, Mrs. Richmond, those two ideas are here in Jefferson's document. Free exercise of religion and establishment of religion, or prohibiting an establishment of religion and promoting religious liberty or free exercise or whatever you want to call it. What does that mean? Is there any point in the document where Jefferson sort of talks about that? It's there at the beginning, right, about the freedom of the human mind not being imposed from without, from right civil incapacitations.
One sentence that's like, have assumed dominion over the face of others. So I think that it could be like in that sentence, he's kind of trying to say like religious freedom is the freedom to have like your own faith and that to like believe what you want to believe, and then next is like setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible. So you can have your own opinions about religion.
Yeah, you're free to, because the mind is free, you must also be free to pursue your own religious opinions. To worship God in the way that you think is best, or that you think God wants you to. I love how he puts it, the last sentence in the second to last paragraph, right? This is the sentence where it says, be it enacted by the General Assembly. Right, again, that first long paragraph starts with the whereas. It's like, here's what we believe. And then the second paragraph, well, here's what we're going to do about it. Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess, and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacity. About that paragraph. If the mind is free, the responsibility of government.
He's kind of trying to say like, so the General Assembly will make it so like they don't have to attend church, like they don't have to be forced to, and
Yeah, they don't have to be forced to go. If they want to, they can. They are welcome to, but this can't force them to attend a church service. Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
and then they say like, their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no ways diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. So like, if they have their own opinions in religion about religion, then that won't affect their civil capacities.
Yeah, as he had said earlier in that first paragraph, he talks about how our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinion. Our civil rights as members of civil society, right, those do not depend on what our specific religious opinions are, any more than what our opinions on physics or geometry, right, might happen to be. You have your civil rights, but those those have no bearing on what your specific religious opinions are. As Jefferson put it in another place, in his Notes on the State of Virginia, which is the only book Jefferson ever wrote, but you'll notice, right, it's not on his tombstone. In Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, he says something like this: the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. My religious opinions don't affect your civil rights. Your religious opinions don't affect mine. Your religious opinions do me no injury. So all men, as he says in this statute, right, ought to be at liberty. All men ought to be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacity. You're free to have whatever religious opinions suit you, so long as you don't harm others in their right. Right? This is right. Religious freedom is not unlimited. Right? None of the founders, not even Jefferson, would say it's right. That's an unlimited right that you can believe and say and do anything that you want. If it starts to harm others' rights, right? For instance, if it harms the public peace, if it upsets the order of society, if it's not in conformity with good citizenship, requirements of good citizenship, then we might need to start talking about specific limits on your religious liberty. Right. So if I live in quiet little Ashland, Ohio here, and it's 8:30 at night. If I think that God wants me to go outside and start yelling and throwing a party right in the middle of the night, worshiping him and being really loud and waking people up on my quiet little street, I'm going to get in trouble with the civil authorities here, with the police. And I can't tell them, hey, I'm just worshiping God according to the dictates of my own conscience. The police would say, well, you're perfectly free to do that, sir, but within the boundaries of the law. You can't harm other people's rights, the right to enjoy the public peace through the exercise of your religious liberty. You got to tone it down.
And this will come up later in the 20th century with cases over should American Indian groups be allowed to use various drugs as part of their religious worship that are illegal substances. Is this a religious right or not? And some surprising groups supported them. Groups who were basically conservative religiously, but they were worried that if religious right, these Indian groups using certain types of drugs, would also impact their religious rights. And it gets complex. All of my students have read things from the Puritans, and they were kind of surprised at how intolerant the Puritans were. They fully believed that God told them that everyone should believe this way and that nobody should deviate. And, Jefferson is saying something very different here.
Great point. Great point. I love that you brought up the Puritans, Mrs. Richmond. Because I mean, the Puritans, American Puritanical Society, right? There's a lot of positive things we could say about it, right? You've got self-governing societies, right? For the very first time, they're sort of ruling themselves according to their own laws and statutes here in America. They come over to the United States seeking religious liberty, but when they're here, the laws that they adopt don't allow for much religious liberty outside of specific state-sanctioned religious liberty, or the state-sanctioned religion, excuse me. That was the way of the world, right? Again, I know we talked about this at the beginning, but you really can't overemphasize the fact that Thomas Jefferson is proposing here. This is, I don't want to say it's brand new. He's not the first one to think these thoughts, but this is the first time where these thoughts are put into action. These thoughts are actually adopted by a legislative assembly, right? And that's also what makes the First Amendment later on so much so special. The way of the world prior to 1776, right? Either you all have to have the official religion, you all have to follow the official religion of the state, or if you follow your own religious opinions, it's merely because the state tolerates you to do so. Is that how Jefferson talks about the right of religious liberty here? That it's merely the state, we're going to tolerate practicing, right, thinking whatever religious opinions you want and practicing your religion in the way that suits you. Does Jefferson say that religious liberty is a gift from government? Right? That religious liberty is something that government tolerates on the part of the people, and you better be thankful for your rulers that they continue to tolerate it, because if they change their minds, whoop, that toleration can be rescinded, and with them your rights. Is that how Jefferson talks about this right of religious liberty in the document?
Well, I think, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yeah, great. Well, what I think is really novel, I mean, I guess it's sort of obvious, but I just wanted to throw it in there, about this whole idea is that there's really, at this point in this document and in the other documents that Jefferson was writing, there's this enormous separation between religion and government and the way you live your life, and there's this idea that although religion may define your life, it doesn't define the way others may view you, or the role that you have in the government, which is really what I think made it enormously different from everything else that had been used in the world before.
Yeah, Lee, that's a good point. I want to can we keep reading some of this document? Can we keep reading? Katie or Catherine, I think you were the one reading for us last time. You did such a good job. Would you mind continuing? Left off that tell a man to furnish contributions of money. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Why don't you start reading there for us?
Okay. That to compel a man to furnish contribution for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. That forcing him to support this or that teacher of his own religious persuasion is depriving him of the comfortable liberty of giving his contributions to the particular pastor, whose morals he would make his pattern, powers he feels most persuasive to righteousness, and is withdrawing from the ministry those temporary rewards, which proceeding from an approbation of their personal conduct are an additional incite earnest and unremitting labors for the instruction of mankind. That our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions, any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. That therefore the prescribing any citizen as unworthy the public confidence, by laying upon him an incapacity of being called to offices of trust and emolument,
Emolument, yes.
unless he profess or renounce this or that religious opinion, is depriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which, in common with his fellow citizens, he has a natural right.
Stop. You notice. First of all, I think we've got another example of an establishment of religion here, right? We were saying establishments of religion would cover an official state religion or the state requiring specific religious opinions to follow, taxpayer-funded churches, or mandatory church attendance. We got another one here as well. It seems like religious test for holding office. Another example of an establishment of religion, right? Requiring citizens to sort of take an oath, or right, claiming that they profess certain religious opinions or denounce others. He says that, right, we're not going to do that. That violates religious liberty. Just notice here in this passage that Catherine just read for us. Again, Catherine, you did it really well. I might need to call on you every time we need something read here. Yeah, very good speaking. What do the rest of you notice? Yeah, please.
I noticed there's no discussion about so far about those who were, I guess, enslaved at that time, because you mentioned that people's religion doesn't affect other civil liberty, but I guess if they're not citizens, they're not in this discourse.
Yeah, he talks about right citizens here. I think to the extent that, well, those are the people that the government's actually going to have control of. Right, government's not going to be able to regulate the behavior, actions, or beliefs of non-citizens. And frankly, we don't have any business telling other peoples what to think or believe or what their rights are. Right? America's not going to tell Frenchmen what their rights as Frenchmen are. You can only sort of explain that for right American citizens. That's definitely a good point. This here.
I notice a tie-in to the Declaration of Independence, again, with Jefferson talking about natural rights. These aren't just things the government gives you, these are natural rights.
Wonderful, wonderful. That follows up nicely on Iman's earlier remark that these are not just sort of rights and privileges of citizens, right? But deeper. The rights of religious liberty are the rights of all mankind. Now, America can't tell right, other peoples how to rule, right, or what the rights of their people are, but America can proclaim to the world what the natural rights of mankind are. And here in this passage that Catherine read, I mean, right where she stopped, what did he say? Right, to do any of these things, right. So, for example, to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical, right? To believe that your civil rights are somehow dependent upon your religious opinions, or to require religious tests for holding office. He says all of these things are a violation of the people's natural right. It's not just, well, government should tolerate, these different religious. That's a different argument than Jefferson's making here. That's the argument you get from John Locke in the letter concerning toleration. Government should tolerate certain, a variety of opinions on. Jefferson takes it a step further. He says, look, toleration's not good enough. It's not that government tolerates you having religious liberty, but you always have religious liberty. That's what it means to have a natural right. And government is instituted to protect those natural rights that pre-exist government itself. And among your natural rights, what did Jefferson list in the Declaration of Independence as your natural or unalienable rights? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, among others. We can add to that list religious liberty. Religious freedom is another of the natural rights of human beings, according to the author of the Declaration of Independence. And look, Jefferson doubles down on that argument at the very end. Look at the very last paragraph. We well know that by the people for the ordinary purposes of legislation only, have no power to restrain the acts of succeeding assemblies, constituted with powers equal to our own, and that therefore to effect in law. We are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act shall be an infringement of natural right. What's Jefferson saying there?
He's saying that if you try to restrict someone's religious liberty, then you're violating their natural rights.
That's right. Jefferson says, look, we're going to pass this law, and we believe this law is in conformity with natural law and natural right. But we're not going to try to bind future legislative assemblies. They can do whatever they want. But if one of the things they want to do is repeal this law that we're passing right now, or somehow restrict, that future assembly will be violating natural right. You guys see that? Sort of you read that paragraph, you're like, wait, what's going on here? But he's saying, first of all, you have a natural right to religious liberty. And that if some future Virginia Legislative Assembly might come along in, I don't know, 2019 or something, and try to roll back this piece of legislation or overturn it completely, Jefferson says, right, they're free to do that. But in doing so, they would be destroying the natural rights of human beings. I want you to also understand that important historical context here is that Jefferson and Madison in Virginia come out strongly, right, in defense of religious liberty and against establishments of religion at the state level. But in many other states, you had establishments of religion. You had official religions in many of the early states. You had taxpayer-funded churches in many of the states, in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, for example, up until 1833, back in Massachusetts. You had religious tests for holding state offices in many of the states. And those things continued even after the First Amendment, because the First Amendment we just read, right, it only applied to Congress, at least initially. So you had establishments of religion in many of the states early on during the American founding. Jefferson and Madison, Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance from the previous year, I think that's 1785, isn't it? Yeah, June 20th, 1785. And then this piece by Jefferson, the next year in January of 1786, were both, the purpose of both was to try to prevent the sort of establishments of religion that you would see in the other states in the Union from coming to Virginia.
I know that one of my students wondered this week when we were discussing this, if this statute influenced the First Amendment. I think it, but
absolutely,
it is so important to remember that that the First Amendment didn't affect every state.
The First Amendment only, as you read, Mrs. Richmond, right? Congress shall make no law,
right,
respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The First Amendment, right, at least originally, up until right, sort of maybe the 14th Amendment changes this a bit, but originally it only applies to Congress, which means the individual state legislatures are free to maybe determine constraints or the limits of religious liberty for themselves,
and
to determine what establishments of religion to adopt for them.
I think partly this problem was because the states or the colonies previously had always been doing that. So this was precedent, and this new government that was a little bit tenuous couldn't step in and say, okay, we're changing the whole ballgame.
Right, right.
Exactly. And like say Maryland, for example, had laws against Jews taking part in, could not hold public office until I believe the 1830s, and there was quite a long-term case about it, and was finally settled in the favor of religious freedom, like that your religion would not affect your ability to take office. But again, that's surprising to many students who think that the First Amendment affected the states, and it didn't.
Right. It did not. It did not initially. But I mean, so the states adopt their own policies for themselves. This is Thomas Jefferson trying to influence the debate in Virginia.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I want to return to the first question that we raised at the beginning of this session about the connection between the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and the Declaration of Independence, or the importance of religious freedom in terms of in terms of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and why Jefferson would say, you know what, first, the one thing I want people to remember about Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. This document have to do with the principles of the Declaration. We've read both documents so far.
Also on freedom, so like how the Declaration of Independence is about how one country is free from the other one, and then now they're talking about how freedom works inside one of the countries.
Yeah, Nick, that's good. Can you say more about that?
Well, like I guess it's kind of like narrowing down. Like the Declaration of Independence is really broad. It's just about like one country's freedoms, but then the religious freedom is like a person's freedom, not a country.
Well, just to push back on that a little bit, doesn't the Declaration say that it's a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all human beings have these rights, and that it's the purpose of all government to protect those rights? The Declaration seems to be pretty universal, right, in terms of, right, these principles apply to everybody. They may not be protected everywhere. They might not be protected anywhere, but this is what we believe. This is what we declare.
Well, maybe he's trying to kind of expand on that idea.
Yeah, how so?
Like he could have gone back and read the Declaration of Independence, and then he could have.
So he sort of knows what it says, right?
So then he could have been like, he wants to add another part. So then he thinks it's very important, so he decides to make another document.
Good point, Nick. Right? I like how you put it. You said it expanded on the principles of the Declaration. It expanded what you saw in the Declaration. It doesn't contradict or conflict or sort of. There's no tension here. Jefferson sort of elaborating on some of the things that he had said in the Declaration of Independence. I don't think you see anything in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom that goes against what we see in the Declaration. But this is a very helpful document, an official founding document from, right, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom I'm talking about. And when you read it alongside the Declaration, you say, okay, I think I'm understanding some of the ideas that were in the Declaration in a better way, in a clearer way, by reading here what Jefferson has to say about, right, the doctrine of natural rights, right, about natural rights and human nature and human beings, and in particular, the freedom of the human mind, religious liberty. That's one of our natural rights, although that's never mentioned in the Declaration. There are 4 references to God in the Declaration of Independence. He's the law, right, the reference to laws of God and nature. He's the creator of human beings. He is divine providence and the supreme judge of the world. But there's no reference to sort of religious liberty, right, as a natural right or as a right that comes from God. But we're told here, no, this absolutely, one of your natural rights is the right of religious freedom. And this right, like your other natural rights, right, doesn't come from civil society, which means civil society doesn't give it and civil society can't take it away, but it comes from God. If it really is a natural right, then it comes from the laws of God and referenced in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence.